So welcome, thanks for coming out on this beautiful sunny day. My name is Melanie Beard, I'm the events manager here at OMSI, and I'm going to be working with Jonathan to put this together, so thanks for coming out. Quick little rundown on how tonight's going to go, or this afternoon. We have about a 35-minute lecture, then we're going to hear a couple readings from the book. We'll have a Q&A session. I will pass a microphone around if you guys want to wait for it so we can all hear everyone's questions. And then we'll go to the store where you can purchase the book and Jonathan will sign it. And so with that, I'll just do a quick little introduction. Jonathan Lung is a volunteer for the USS Blueback and started in high school as a freshman in 2002. He started leading public tours and is now mostly involved with the maintenance crew and in special projects because he's not exactly local anymore. And so he now works as an air traffic controller at HNL. So let's give him a warm welcome.
On first. Everyone hear me okay? All right. Thank you very, very much to Melanie for really taking the lead in putting this event together. Also thank you to Nancy Stuber, Russ Rep, John Farmer, the crew of the USS Blueback, both past and present, and Corey Walden, my assistant, friend since the 5th grade of high school, and he was with me when we started this project 11 years ago. Almost, and to the present day, I always bounce ideas off of him. So without these people, I wouldn't be standing up here today sharing this, the culmination of this project with everyone, and they're very instrumental to all of this, so thank you very much. I'm going to begin by outlining the presentation a little bit for everyone. I'm going to focus more on the interviews and the development of the writing as opposed to the final product or the final book itself, because this is the more unique aspect of the project. So I'm going to split the presentation into two parts. We'll talk about the interviews and then we'll transition to the writing. Now, the interviews were conducted over the course of 8 weeks in the summer of 2008. The first couple sessions were done on the Blueback, and then we moved them up to the cafeteria here in the building. And the original impetus for moving the interviews was actually primarily because of food logistics. We had catered meals before each session, and it quickly became quite the chore to cart everything down the ramp to the dock, haul it down through the narrow stairwells, passageways, watertight doors into the compartment set up there, and then after we had finished to reverse the process and bring it back out again. So by moving up to the cafeteria, it saved us a lot of time. Also, as you can see, it's much more spacious and more comfortable for everyone. If anyone's been down on the Blueback, you can imagine 16 or 18 of us sitting around the wardroom table. And these guys are used to it, but I definitely wasn't. There was one particular downside, though, to having the interviews in the cafeteria. That was that the sound quality of the recordings just wasn't as good. But it was a kind of a small price to pay for the benefits. I'm going to talk a little bit about the interview planning process a little bit. Excuse me. And we structured each day or session by themes. And these themes became the basis for the different chapters in the book. So for the example, in the first day, I asked questions like, why did you join the Navy? Why did you choose the submarine service? We talked about initial experiences like submarine school, other forms of specialty training, their first time on a submarine, qualifying, and all of that became the basis for the first chapter, which is appropriately titled Adventures Beginning. So each different interview session was themed like that. And the weekend before, Corey and I would gather at a coffee shop and we'd set the agenda for the next day, and then we'd start brainstorming questions. And to his credit, Corey was a marvelous question generator. A lot of the ones we asked were created by him. But ultimately, the questions that we came up with, the batch of questions, ended up serving more as discussion starters. Unlike a traditional interview where I would interview someone and ask a question one-on-one and I'd get a response, in the group interview, it was almost like I would ask a question as a topic starter, someone would answer it, and then I would take the leash off, and then you get a group discussion that way. And the group, I want to expand a little bit about the format of the group interviews. And they were born originally from Monday work parties. And so for those of you who aren't closely tied to Blueback, every Monday the maintenance crew, the maintenance volunteers, gather on the submarine to work on various projects. They can be as mundane as changing light bulbs to more involved projects like replacing parts of the deck or installing sound effects simulators on board the boat. A couple years ago, some of our volunteers, they went in and rewired a couple things in the torpedo room. So now you can go in and pull a trigger switch and you can hear the simulated effect of the whooshing of a torpedo being launched from the tube. So it's pretty awesome. And the kids love it. They can get around and it makes the exhibit interactive and they can play around with different things like that. And so the Monday work parties were a natural opportunity to do the interviews because half of the crew was there already. They're already present, all the maintenance guys were there. All I had to do was to kind of schedule the tour guides and make sure everyone was there at the same time. And a quick shout out here to R.G. Walker, seen here in front, regaling everyone of a tall tale of his time in the service. For those of you who know R.G. R.G. was the manager of the Blueback at the time, and he's the one who gave me my volunteer job at age 15, so many thanks to him. But he was also instrumental in putting all this, the logistics and organizing the crew. He helped us figure out, because we were essentially taking his Monday slot, so how to postpone, delay, or move our maintenance projects to different days so we could devote the Mondays to the interviews. And so he played a very big part in the success of this project. A little bit more about the benefits of the group interviews. This photo was actually taken from our last session, our very last session in August of 2008. We're missing a couple people there, but there's two people there who particularly stand out of a different age demographic. The other one's Corey. So a little bit about the benefits of doing this in a group format. The obvious one is that it's logistically easier. Instead of having to schedule 17 individual one-on-one sessions, we covered the same and arguably a lot more in just 8. So we shaved off half the time and got a lot more out of it. And as we proceeded forward with these group interviews, it became apparent that there's a lot of unanticipated gems that really developed from the process. First and foremost, the conversation amongst the veterans resembled more of a discussion among peers. And it created a more comfortable setting for everyone to share their stories and really allowed for more candidness in the responses. And that's one of my favorite aspects about the interviews you read in the book. Also, you would get feedback and interactions from everybody, and which helped in turn helped me identify changes over time, and as well as compare and contrast different experiences. Now, if we did the interviews in an individual setting, I would have a response from person A, I would ask the same question to person B, get a response, and then after the fact, compare and analyze the two responses. But in the group setting, I'd ask the question, person A responds, and person B would speak up afterwards and say, well, by the time I was in 10 years or later, things had changed like this. So they really did the heavy lifting as far as the analysis side for me. And another aspect that I want to go more in depth about is topics that came up because of the group interview setting that would not have come up otherwise. And the primary reason is because I simply hadn't prepared any questions on those. And there's two specific examples that I want to share. The first one is on uniforms. So as I was transcribing the clips, I would organize the passages into different documents or different parts of documents. And so, for example, going back, questions about why did you join the Navy, those all went into one section of a document. And questions about, let's say, Soviet submarines went into another section, questions about submarine school in another section. But with this group format, you would get a lot of kind of off-topic passages, things that kind of went astray. Some things that were very valuable, but I didn't quite know how to place them because they weren't a response to any particular question. So I had a miscellaneous document where I just kind of put them in there. And as I built more and more of these passages, I started noticing a theme, and that a lot of these passages were about uniforms. They weren't particular to any certain day of the interviews. They weren't particular to any certain person. Everybody talked about them. And it quickly became apparent how integral the uniform was to the naval experience and the experience of serving in the military, and also how proud these guys were of being able to wear the uniform, To me, that was something really special. I didn't ask a single question about it, and yet here it came up organically. And so that's how the subsection on uniforms was created. It's devoted entirely to that. It's in chapter 3 where I talk about the culture of the submarine service. The other topic that I want to mention that came up without me asking any questions was the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, as we discussed the Cold War, we had one day that was completely devoted to the Cold War. We talked about the United States versus the Soviet Union. We talked about the giant geopolitical conflict framing this entire era. And I was aware and knowledgeable of the crisis, but I didn't really think about asking any questions about it because it didn't occur to me that it was relevant to submarine sailors. But as we discussed Soviet submarines and the conflict, Bob Sumner, seen here on the left in the long sleeve navy blue shirt, he raised this point. Bob served on the Sea Poacher, USS Sea Poacher, which was based out of Key West, Florida during that era. And he basically began, right, we're talking about the Cold War, and he said, well, in my day, it was actually Cuba. And he told us about how his submarine operated in the Caribbean most of the time, went in and out of Guantanamo Bay, which was and still is a Navy base to this day, and was part of the early stages of the blockade or Kennedy's naval quarantine during the crisis. And he spoke up and was able to do it because it kind of connected to something else that we had talked about earlier, and that's solely because of we did the interviews in the group format. And so, as if that wasn't enough, his story triggered a memory from Chuck Nelson, seen here second from the left in the striped shirt wearing his OMSI badge. And Chuck, who unfortunately passed away a few years ago, was actually in submarine school in New London, Connecticut during the time of the crisis. So he wasn't a direct participant, but once Sumner told his story, Chuck Nelson was like, oh, that reminds me of the time. And he was able to tell us how the crisis impacted him a couple of thousand miles away. And he was in submarine school, and he told about how his classmates got pulled out of classes and pressed in service in the fleet because they needed warm bodies as they were ramping up operations. He talked about the security lockdown that happened on the base because of the crisis and how you couldn't access certain things anymore, even though you were a sailor in the Navy. And so that was very, very interesting. Again, all of it because of the group format. And so the counterfactual to all of this is that had the interviews been one-on-one individual conversations, a lot of the topics may not have come up, and the responses would surely have been way more measured, more compartmentalized. So that's the first part. And now we're going to go to a kind of more interactive part of the presentation. I'm going to talk about the writing, and I'm going to focus on 3 important landmarks or checkpoints during the early stages of the writing process that really shaped the book. And I'm going to share 3 excerpts from the book. The first one, the setting for the first one happens in my senior history thesis class at Swarthmore College. And the original idea for doing this project was always to write a book. That was the first and originally only goal of it. But then I decided to be greedy and found out that I could double dip and get a thesis out of it and get out and graduate from college. That sounds pretty good. And so this thesis class was structured very much like our group interviews. We met once a week, every week, and each class was themed. So we'd have a day where we would focus on developing historiographies, one day on bibliographies. This particular day I'm going to talk about, we were focused on primary sources. And so all of us had to show up to class and share a primary source with your classmates and talk about how that would contribute to your research project. And so, one by one, you go around the class and everyone shares some, dusty document they pulled out from the archives. Some of these were very, very obscure. But when it was my turn, I plugged in my archaic first generation iPod Touch into the classroom sound system. This is fall of 2008. And I played a clip from these interviews, and we're going to share this particular passage with everyone today. First, we're going to do the reading, and I'd like to invite Chuck Macaluso on stage, because this is his story after all. I thought, what a better way than to have the original guy share it himself. So if everyone give Chuck a warm welcome, please. We are going to, hey Chuck, this is how you looked 10 years ago. Pretty good, huh? Hey! So the background context of this particular story is that we're all sitting around the table sharing, we're talking about the dangers of the submarine service. And everyone's going around and sharing a particular instance when his respective submarine flooded, which is a shockingly common occurrence. I was really surprised. And it's Chuck's turn here, and he's talking about the Patrick Henry. That was your first boat?
Yes.
Yeah, that was your first boat. And we're going to read from the book, and then I'm going to share with everyone the original clip that was recorded during the interviews. All right. Macaluso described a telling experience in late 1981 on board the Patrick Henry, which revealed some uncomfortable aspects of the Navy's maintenance program. Standing watch as an electronics technician, he began.
We got rid of our missiles, and now we were a slow attack approach submarine doing local ops out of Hawaii. We went out to sea. And I must have done this a million times. I'm sitting in Nav Center, and I've got the headphones on, and I'm looking back in the back corner. We're ventilating, and I'm looking through a window into the fan room, through another door in there, into the low-pressure blower room. And at this point, I've been told for 2 years now, see if you see any water coming down. Let us know. When you've done this 100 times and you've never seen any water coming through 2 scratched up windows, the first time I saw water coming through there, I'm sitting on the headphones, I'm half asleep, I start looking through the lights. Is that water coming through? And then over the headphones, I hear radio reports that they've got water coming into the lower level. It's grounding out all their equipment. And then that's when I get on the headphones and report to control that we have flooding in the low-pressure blower room. The boat takes an up angle. The front of the nav center door opens up, and a wave of water comes at me, and I'm in the back of nav center up against some electronic equipment, and I'm wondering if I'm going to get electrocuted. I don't know. You're not supposed to see water around all this equipment, and we ended up getting to the surface and doing a bucket brigade. I think we took on about 1,500 gallons of water on the boat, and it was a bucket brigade from the low pressure blower room down to the toilets, down to the shitter, back and forth. That's how we got rid of it. We ended up not coming into port, and I think the captain ended up reporting something less than what was really flooded so they could keep the boat out at sea. That's the first time I saw water in a boat, and I've never seen water coming on a boat like that.
For the veterans listening to Macaluso's story, the most surprising aspect of the whole incident was not the amount of water the boat took on, but the fact that the Patrick Henry had to utilize a bucket brigade to dispose of the water, that the flooding didn't automatically drain to the bilges. This prompted Macaluso to deliver a shocking verdict on the state of his submarine.
A lot of our pumps weren't working. We were an older boat, and we weren't well maintained after we came in on FPM, better known as a slow approach. Yeah, that was kind of freaky.
So now I'm going to play the original for everyone. Oh, okay, sure. So I want everyone to kind of focus in on the differences between the clip and then the passage that we're talking
Dangerous things happen too on boom boats.
Sure.
Because when I was on the well, it was a slow approach at this time. I was on the Patrick Henry. We got rid of our missiles, and now we were a slow approach doing outside Hawaii. We went out to sea, and I must have done this a million times. I'm sitting in the nav center. I got the headphones on. I'm in the back corner. We're ventilating, and I'm looking through a window into the blower room, the fan room, through another door in there into the low pressure blower room. And the point was, I've been told for 2 years now, see if you see any water coming down. When you've done this 100 times, you've never seen any water coming through 2 scratched up windows. The first time I saw water coming through there, I'm sitting there in the headphones, I'm half asleep, I'm looking, I start looking through the lights.
I can see real well
water
there.
coming through? And over the headphones, I hear radio report that they've got water coming in the lower level, drowning all the radio gear. Okay? And then that's what I got on the headphones, and then I report to control, we got flooding in the low pressure blower room. And the boat takes an up angle, the front end of the nav center door opens up, a wave of water comes at me, and I'm in the back of nav center, and I've got this electronic equipment around me. It splashes up against equipment. I'm wondering if I'm going to get electrocuted, and I don't know. I'm not supposed to see water around all this equipment. And we ended up getting to the surface and doing a bucket brigade. I think we took on about 1,500 gallons of water on the boat. And there's a bucket brigade from the low pressure blower room down to the toilets, you know. And they shipped it back and forth. That's how we got rid of it. And we ended up not coming in, and I think the captain ended up reporting in something less than what it really was, the boat out to sea. But yeah, there was like a 3-4 inch weight of water coming at me. The boat took it up angle, came at me, and it's picking up speed 20 feet ahead of me. It's up against me. That's the first time I saw water in a boat, and I've never seen water, coming in on a boat like that.
So that wouldn't automatically drain to bilges?
Yeah, it was an upper level, it went through a middle level, and it went all the way down to the lower level, and then it went to the village. And the way it passed through, just ran along
Why'd you have to use
runways.
Yeah, it wouldn't draw
Well,
normally drain.
a lot of our pumps weren't working. We're an older boat, we weren't well maintained after we became a non-FPM.
You might have a compartment that can change feet long,
Right,
this section here, this section here, and nothing in the middle. We had lots of those to the mouse house.
Yeah, that was kind of freaky.
All right, so there's two important parts of that clip that I wanted everyone to notice. First one was the dynamic of the group, how they interacted with each other, how they asked each other questions when they weren't sure, and that's what I was referring to earlier, what made these interviews so special. And the other thing was the gallows humor of these gentlemen there. When Chuck talks about how he's has this electronic equipment wrapped around him and is about to be electrocuted, maybe, everyone bursts out laughing, right? And I found it absolutely hilarious that these guys found it hilarious because it's funny because this is a life or death situation, but I quickly came to realize that this is something that was unique to submarine sailors, and the gallows humor was a way they kind of a coping mechanism of sorts to help deal with some of the absurdities of having to serve on a submarine. So that was really, really neat. And when I got the feedback from my classmates in that session, when I played this clip to my classmates, everyone was very impressed. And I got a lot of comments. It was the same thing about this part where you're talking about being electrocuted, but instead of laughing, they were impressed by the fact that in your voice you could hear fear, you could hear uncertainty, and to me that was really, really valuable. So that was lesson number one. Somehow I do reserve the emotions in those clips and transfer it to my writing and the words. And so now we're going to do excerpt number 2. This is another one of Chuck's stories. And the setting for this one is I am transcribing clips now. And I have all these clips of passages of quotes, and now I have to write them, string them together, make it some sort of logical flow through it. And the question is, should I narrate the stories that they told, or should I narrate around them? Where does my voice fit? And so this was a very, very difficult thing to kind of ponder. So what I did is I took this story, I wrote it in 2 different ways. I had 2 samples, and I polled my college friends with these 2 samples to see what they thought. And let's see here, forward this. So the background context of this particular story is the USS Parche. The Parche, seen in this picture up there, was one of the Navy's premier spy submarines towards the end of the Cold War. She was specially fitted for intelligence gathering missions such as cable tapping. The mini sub you see on the perched on the top there is known as a DSRV, or Deep Submergence Rescue Vehicle. It was ostensibly designed to extract trapped sailors from a disabled submarine. It was disabled somewhere shallow enough to still remain intact and recoverable. But the one in this particular picture is actually a fake. It's not a real one. It's a welded down model that's actually a decompression chamber for Navy divers to enter and exit the Parche so that they can swim out and install tap pods on Soviet communications cables lying on the bottom of the ocean floor. Chuck served on the Parche for 3 years. We can't really talk about many of these missions, but he did share something very interesting in the book. And first, I'm going to read for everyone the passage that's not in the book. Upon receiving his assignment to the Parche, Chuck Macaluso was required to undergo special training. None of the schools he attended are listed in his service record. He wasn't allowed to tell anyone where he was going or who he was training with. The only thing his wife knew was the state he was traveling to. Any information as to what department he worked in, what division he was assigned to, what equipment he worked on, all of that was kept under the lid. The training was conducted entirely by civilian companies and scientists, and Macaluso himself had to don the facade of a civilian. He was not allowed to wear his uniform, nor show his ID card, nor even carry on a conversation about the military while in public. When he logged in at a training center and was prompted for his employer, Macaluso responded, "Self-employed." This was the US Navy's version of the CIA. This was a lockdown to the hilt. And in 1991, Macaluso departed from the Parchi after 3 years aboard. Once he was allowed to step away from the experience, something suddenly dawned on him. I didn't realize how stressed I was after actually being on that boat, because of all the things you couldn't say. You always had to be careful who you talked to. So now we'll read you the one that's actually in the book.
Or I'll read it.
Yeah, we'll read it. I'll read the beginning part. The USS Parchi, of course, was the Navy's premier special operations submarine at the end of the Cold War. Like her famous predecessors, she had been specially refitted for intelligence gathering missions, and both the submarine and her crew carried some of the most closely guarded national defense secrets. Macaluso's experience on board the Parchi redefined the silent service for him.
When I was on the Parchi, I had to go to training. I mean, the silent service is already, you don't talk much about where you go. But while I was on the Parchi, it was even more locked down. So I'd go to these schools, and none of it's in my service record. I couldn't tell my wife where I was going. I could tell her what state I'm traveling to get the training, but I could not tell her whom I was training with. And all our training was done with civilian companies and physicists and scientists. We log into the building. Who's your employer? Self-employed. You don't travel with your uniform. You couldn't talk about the military. You couldn't take anything with me. I couldn't show my ID card when I was on travel. I was on the boat for 3 years, and my wife didn't know what department I was in, what division I was in, what equipment I worked on. And I can tell you that was kind of stressful, because I remember after I got off the boat after 3 years, I didn't realize how stressed I was after actually being on the boat because of all the things you couldn't say. You always had to be careful who you talked to. I had friends out in the civilian community. You couldn't tell them what you did, so conversations didn't go very far that way. It was a tight group on board the boat, but it was just so locked down.
So when I got the comments from my friends, well, I think around 20 friends, it was about 85-15 in favor of the second sample, the one that Chuck just read. And connected with the first lesson I talked about, it really demonstrated the power of authenticity. So that was lesson number 2. No matter how good my writing was, nothing could match the original story. The last excerpt I'm going to share here is one by Collie Collins, who's here with us, but he's a little shy, so I'll read his story from there. Though for those of you who know Collie. And seen here, second from the left, Collie was a hospital corpsman in the Navy. Hospital corpsmen are like battlefield doctors, essentially. He served in the Korean War, was attached to the U.S. Marines during the war, received a Purple Heart in the conflict, entered the submarine service after that. And Collie is 90 years young today. Congratulations, Collie. And the setting for this is about the editorial decisions that went to transcribing the interviews. So when I played the first clip, we talked a little bit about how the clip differed from the passage that we read. And in this one, the differences are more pronounced, and I'll explain a little bit why after we hear this. The background context for the story is the USS Thresher disaster. The Thresher was a state-of-the-art nuclear-powered attack submarine that was commissioned in the early 60s. It was conducting a set of deep dives, test dives, off of the coast of Massachusetts when something went terribly wrong, and it was lost at sea. And after exhaustive searching, and once they found an investigation, the Navy concluded that a pipe joint burst on board the submarine, and essentially was the equivalent of opening a fire hose in the Thresher and flooding the submarine at a rate at which it was not recoverable. Combined with the loss of propulsion as the nuclear reactor shut down, it's not definitively known which came first. One may have caused the other. It couldn't get back up to the surface and slowly sank past this crushed depth. Now, the crushed depth for a submarine is the depth at which the ocean pressure above it is too great for the steel hull to handle, and it simply implodes upon itself, just like crushing a pop can, just like that. And once it passed it, it brought down with her 129 sailors in April 1963, the deadliest submarine disaster in U.S. Navy history. So this disaster is referenced in this particular passage, and I'm going to read it from the book first. But for Collins, the Thresher tragedy was a bit more personal. I was in the hospital. I was trying to get duty on the West Coast because I had been on the East Coast for about 4 or 5 years, and I wanted to get back on the other side. So I was real tickled when they told me I had an ulcer. So I was in the hospital. I had done the tube down the throat, the whole 10 yards, had been there about 2 weeks, and I had only had 2 weeks to go. I'm treading gently. I'm staying out of sight. Don't want to rock the boat. Let's do it, and I can get the hell out of here. Then Rickover sent some of his cronies down to the hospital. They needed nuclear-trained corpsmen real quick. And they came through. They're shaking everybody out. And I'm thinking, okay, they're going to take all those guys. Those guys are okay. And they came up to me, and he says, "You're going." "I got an ulcer. I can't go back to the boats." "Oh, yes, we need you." I'm thinking, oh, Christ. So I had to get out of the hospital, go check out, got ready to go. That night, there was a big thunderstorm, big typhoon crap came through. I couldn't get out on the aircraft that night, couldn't make that plane, couldn't execute the orders. I went back, I said, "I can't go to Portsmouth." And they said, "Well, you don't have to now." The Thresher, which I had orders to, went down that day. And God, I'd kissed somebody's ass. So now I'm going to play the clip, if you wouldn't mind. Melanie, thank you.
I was in the hospital and during the Cold War, right? And this is about the Cuban crisis bit. And I had worked hard for this ulcer because I was trying to get duty on the West Coast. I've been on the East Coast about 4 or 5 years, and I was wanting to get back to the other side. So I was real tickled when they told me I had an ulcer. So I was in the hospital. I had done the tube down the throat, the whole 10 yards. I've been there about 2 weeks. And I only had 2 weeks to go, and I'm treading gently. I'm staying out of sight. Don't want to rock the boat. Let's do it, and I get the hell out of here. And then the Cuban crisis hit the fan. Rickover sent some of his cronies down through the hospital. They needed nuclear-trained corpsmen real quick. And came through, and they're shaking everybody out. And I'm thinking, okay, they're going to take all those guys. Those guys are okay. And they came up to me and says, "You're going." I said, "I got an ulcer. I can't go back to the boats." "Oh, yes, we need you." I said, "I got an ulcer." They actually went down. God's truth, they got a case of Maalox and gave me a case of Maalox and gave me orders to one of the boats. So I'm thinking, oh, Christ. So I had to go down and get out of the hospital, go check out, got ready to go. That night, there was a big thunderstorm, big typhoon crap came through. I couldn't get out on the aircraft that night, couldn't make that plane, couldn't execute the orders. I went back, I said, "I can't go to Portsmouth." And they said, "Well, you don't have to now." The Thresher, which had orders to, went down that day.
Oh.
Yes.
What? The what?
The Thresher had orders to the Thresher.
Wow.
And God, I kissed somebody's ass. I don't know. And then they gave me orders to the Proteus. So I got my Maalox. They gave me a whole case of Maalox.
So there are two important parts of this clip that aren't in the excerpt I read. First one was the reaction from the other veterans. You heard all the woes and the wows. And then, I mean, this is like, essentially like, missing one of the doomed flights on 9/11 because you were accidentally stuck in traffic, right? This is like the same kind of situation, same weight to it. And the other thing that wasn't in there were certain parts that you noticed that I cut out from the book, such as Colley's funny story about the Maalox. And when I was transcribing these stories, I had to kind of figure out what are my aims, what are my goals. And for this one in particular, but for all the passages, I realized that my goal was really to help the reader focus on the emotion and the gravity of the story. And so that was lesson number 3. As the transcriber and author, I had to make editorial decisions that would help bring home to the reader the greatest impact, give these clips a purpose in the book. And so, as a result, I had to somehow convert the woes and the wows from the other guys and draw it out organically from the reader by just reading Colley's words. And also, the Maylock story, although hilarious, I felt like kind of distracted from really the gravity and weight of the story, so that's why I omitted it. And so in conclusion, these are the 3 big lessons that really shape the writing in the book, and when you read it, you'll be able to see their influences from beginning to end. And that's it for the first part. Chuck, thank you so much for joining us today. And Colley, thank you as well for letting us share your story. Some of these guys who are part of the interview project are here today. We'll have a chance later on, kind of a little meet and greet. A lot of them are wearing their submarine veterans, their vests and their shirts, so easy to pick out. But right now I'd like to transition a little bit to the Q&A part, and we'll have a couple microphones to pass out, or I mean, this small enough, intimate enough, if you just want to stand up and ask your question too. But I think it would be good so that everyone can hear the question. Yeah. And then, and I'll go ahead and take any questions. Thank you very much. Yes?
So Jonathan, when you were 15 years old and volunteering, did you come specifically to go down to the Blueback or just to OMSI and get assigned?
Yeah, so this was the story. So I had been interested in naval history since let's say the 4th grade. My 4th grade teacher, Lori Pop, is embarrassed here. My 3rd grade teacher, Barbara Carl, is also here. These aren't really my inspirations. This is kind of what brought me my love and pursuit of learning. But in my beginning of my freshman year, kind of looking for things to do. Like they'll tell you to get out and volunteer in the community. And my mom was like, "Oh, you should check out OMSI. They have a submarine there. I think you'd be really into that." So I signed up. They gave me the generic interview, and they said, "Okay, we'll start you off with sub-queuing." And I didn't know what that was at the time. It's basically you're up in the building. It's a important job. You go to the safety aspects of getting visitors on board the submarine, and you take their tickets and give them a briefing, all that stuff. But that wasn't really what I wanted to do. I wanted to give tours, right? This is 15-year-old me. I was showing Melanie earlier. This is my original badge as a 15-year-old from volunteering in 2002. And so I went down, I met with RG. I think it's all RG's back there in the Hawaiian. And I went down to interview with him. It was a cold, dark, early winter evening, and I must have impressed him enough, I guess. And he's like, "Sure, come down, give some tours." Garth was there, Alan Nolan was there. Ellen, is he here today? I'm not quite sure. And some other guys. And that's how I started. They made me a part of their family, just really welcomed me. Someone who's, most of the volunteers on there are submarine veterans. Slight age difference for me as well. But they just made me part of the family. And that to me was something that was very, very tremendously special to me. So I've been there ever since, and that's kind of when one of them, who I was there with at the beginning, Pat Patterson, when he passed away my sophomore year of college, that was when I was really like, oh, you know what, I should really get these stories down. That was the original driving, motivating factor for doing the interviews, doing the book. Yeah. So it was always my intent to volunteer, be on the submarine, but at the time, I had no idea it turned out like this. Yes?
I can remember all the way back.
This is Corey's dad. This is my sister and his father. We've been friends for a long, long time.
Since the 3rd grade. I can remember farther back than that, back into grammar school with you guys going to.
I don't think any of us went to the grammar school. That's like from the 60s, right?
They'd go to all the fleet weeks, and
yeah.
And your dad, I think, took you up in the Seattle area to look at ships, and you did that here. I've got pictures of you guys down here in grammar school coming to houses. So it's been a longer transition than that.
Please.
You mentioned how being together with the other guys would bring back memories of stimulating. Was being on the boat itself, or were there physical equipment that assisted bring jogging memories? I mean, was that?
At first, sometimes maybe, but like for us, it's very useful as tour guides. Like for me, you know, I don't read from a script when I give a tour, but I have all these things there. I'm in the compartment, I'm looking at it. This is the wardrobe table, there's a light above it. It's an operating table light. And it's like, oh yeah, so the table also doubles as an operating table if someone has to go in the knife in the wardrobe. So all these are physical cues. But for the interviews themselves, not as much, because the first couple sessions were located just in the wardroom. So it wasn't like we had different sessions in different parts of the submarine. And then once we moved up to the cafeteria, it was almost like, yeah, that physical part became removed. Good question, thank you. Yes?
So knowing that you've been working on this for somewhere between a decade, 15 years in some capacity, I imagine you probably had a vision of what you wanted the nonfiction novel to be, and maybe some influences, literary influences that kind of shaped that vision. So curious, just like what were your early influences, and then how does the final product compare to what you thought it would be 10, 11 years ago?
The groundbreaking seminal work of this field, submarine history, is very limited, first of all, as a genre, because of the whole idea of the submarine service being the silent service, of having these guys all these secrets. I'm sure Chuck has so many things that he can't share with us today. But these guys, these sailors, were also told not to share their stories, to keep everything zipped, right? That's part of serving in the submarine service. And so the first work that came out that kind of was the watershed in which kind of let this all go to the side, what happened about, so it was 7 years after the Cold War ended. It's called Blind Man's Bluff by Sherry Sontag and Christopher Drew. And they were newspaper reporters, journalists. They worked for the Chicago Tribune and the New York Times. And they worked on it probably as long, if not longer than I did with my project. Theirs is much more extensive. And at least 7, 8 years of strictly research, thousands of interviews. Most of them are anonymous because they didn't want to reveal their identities. And they put together this groundbreaking treatise about the submarine service in the Cold War. I highly recommend it. So Blind Man's Bluff, that was kind of the first book that kind of, also it was an eye-opener for all these guys, because they would read it and be like, oh, maybe I can share some of these stories now, you know, the Cold War is over. And really that was kind of like the driving force behind that. They're both excellent writers. When I was in the early stages of this project, I actually met up with Chris Drew in his New York Times office, and he was very, very generous. He helped me out with a lot of stuff, and he was just, he gave me a lot of kind of inspiration as well as advice in writing and going through the whole process. And that to me was very important. And we kept in touch, and he ended up doing one of the reviews for my book, so I'm very grateful for that. And but that would probably be the one that this is really based off of. And I even consider it kind of a companion piece. Yes?
Where did the original inspiration for starting the interviews on the submarine come?
Good question. So the interviews, so I mentioned a little bit about Pat Patterson, and he was a friend, a tour guide on the Blueback. He actually served on the Blueback, one of the few that we had who had served on this boat and was a tour guide for OMSI. And he passed away, and we were good friends, and he would tell me all these stories. And then, you know, I was like, that's too bad, because I wish I had heard more, you know. And now that he's gone, there's no record of it. And so that was my sophomore year. I was of college. That was, I think, 2006 or 2007. And I was like, and I had all these other friends on board the Blueback. It's like, let's not let that happen. And so my junior year, between junior and seniors, I applied for a grant from Swarthmore College to do the interviews. And I spent all of it on food for these guys. So where the money. It was good food, right? And we would get together and do these interviews. And I was just very, very lucky, because there were 17 guys around that table. 2 of them aren't here with us anymore. The oldest guy, Fred Carno, he was actually in World War II at the D-Day landings in Normandy, France. And even though that's not part of this book, he was on a tank landing ship. I ended up doing a side interview with him where I asked him about his World War II experiences. I kept those clips. And when he passed away, I was able to put all the audio recordings together and give it to his family. And so that was what really made this project, things like this, really worthwhile. And I talked to his son Scott yesterday. He was at our kind of reunion lunch, and he just, it was very, very moving how much they appreciate that. Very good question. Yes, in the back.
So in your book, I haven't read it yet.
Hey, what's up?
You have stories about tapping those fiber optic cables in the North Sea very well.
That particularly is Chris, Drew, and Sherry Sondag did such a good job of that. That was more of their investigative report. If you read Blind Man's Bluff, they'll have all the nuts and bolts about that. Mine, I was aiming more for the social history aspect, what it's like to live and work and serve on board a submarine, the human element as opposed to the missions. Some of the missions are briefly touched upon in chapter 4, which is the only one out of 6 chapters that is devoted to the Cold War, specifically as kind of a geopolitical conflict. But there really isn't very much about it. In fact, I don't think, I maybe mentioned it once or twice in the book, like the cable tapping thing. Is there another? Yes, sir.
Are all the veterans from Oregon?
Most of them, yes. We all at one point volunteered on the Blueback. Some of them have moved away since. Chris Stafford, who's here today, and Herb Herman. Chris now lives in San Diego. Herb lives in just outside of Phoenix. But they were all, now they didn't necessarily join the Navy from Portland. I think only a third of the volunteers grew up in Portland, so to speak. But they all moved to Portland at different times of their lives, settled down here, became volunteers at the museum, became volunteers on the Blueback. And that's where I met everyone, was on board the submarine here. Yes?
You ever thought about going in the Navy as a submariner?
Well, that's right. I don't think I have the disposition to do that. Yeah, I feel like I'm too OCD. I don't wash my hands, gotta take some showers, at least a shower more than once every 2 weeks. But I think my current career is okay. Yes, Herb.
Hi, my name's Herb, and I just wanted to fill you in on a couple of things. Those of you that are with OMSI, Carl here was one of the original guys that went up to Seattle and Bremerton and helped bring back parts for the Blueback. He hasn't been around here for a while. But then I wanted to talk about the book a minute. I read one chapter this morning, and it's a very humorous book because it comes from the viewpoint of the different guys that served on the Blueback, served as maintenance of the Blueback. And I happen to have served on both the diesel boat and the nuke boat. The diesel boat people are all crazy. The nuke boat people are only half crazy. He is half crazy because he is an air traffic controller qualified in radar, and I can speak to that too because I'm a retired air traffic controller. I anticipate a book coming out by Jonathan in the not too distant future about air traffic control. This is good. If you have kids, grandkids, that are interested in the submarine service, I would encourage them to take a look at that book.
Herb, thank you so much for that. That was very, very important. A lot of my colleagues from Portland Tower and the Radar Approach are here today, and I want to say a little bit more about Herb because Herb and I met the summer of the interviews. I had decided to become an air traffic controller that summer, but I didn't. That was all I knew. Right? I was still in college, still doing that stuff. And Herb's niece is married to Kevin Smith. And Herb took me to the TRACON for the first time in 2008. That was my first impression of an air traffic facility. So that's kind of how it got started. It's a very, very small world. Yeah. JD, you had a question?
So what is the favorite uniform? Just asking.
Oh, the favorite uniform, dress blues, right? Yeah, dress blues, hands down, dress blues.
Cracker Jacks?
Yes, Cracker Jack sailor.
And seafarers?
Yep.
Okay. Just wanted to make sure they had it right.
Okay. Yes. The Navy air traffic controller wasn't quite fit for submarines. Anyone else? All right, so that'll wrap up, I guess, the Q&A session. Again, I just want to thank everyone for coming today, for making this such a special day for these veterans, but especially for myself. I'm very moved by all the support, so thank you all very, very much. I'm going to take about 10 to 15 minutes, do some meet and greet. I know a lot of you had the books already, but I think there's some of you who don't. So in about 15 minutes, I'll relocate to the science store, and I'll do these signings there, I think. All righty, thank you all very, very much.